The alien stared at the human doctor, confused by the trembling in his hands, blood on his gloves, silence in the room. "Why do you cry when your patient dies?" the alien asked. The doctor looked up, tears in his eyes. Because that was someone's everything. That's when the galaxy learned what it truly meant to be human. They didn't understand, not at first. To the interstellar races, medicine was mathematics, chemicals, diagnostics, procedure. When someone died, it was data lost, a statistical failure. Move on, log the error, repair the damage. But humans, they didn't treat death as numbers. They treated it like a war they refused to lose, even when it was inevitable. On the orbiting medical vessel Sanctum, where dozens of species sought healing, there worked a human doctor named Elias Ward. Known for his tireless commitment, he often worked through pain, sleep deprivation, and even injury. The other species admired him, not for his biology, but for his fire. One evening, a young Kaleri child, a fragile race whose biology was notoriously difficult to stabilize, was rushed into surgery after a mining accident. Multiple systems failing. No time to wait for specialized care. Elias stepped in. No hesitation. No promise. Just action. For over 6 grueling hours, he fought to keep her alive, improvising equipment, adapting human tools to alien anatomy, even going so far as to use his own blood plasma to stabilize a collapse. But she didn't make it. The moment the monitors went flat, the room fell into silence. The other medics stood still, unsure what to do next. Elias remained frozen, staring at the child's small, lifeless body. Then he did something no one expected. He removed his gloves, sat beside the table, and wept. Not quietly, not with restraint. He wept with the full force of a man who had just lost a battle he needed to win. An Argonaean surgeon, cold and logical, asked him later, "Why do you weep? You did all you could." Statistically, survival was 12%. Elias looked at him, eyes red, voice hoarse. Because she had a name. Because someone out there will never see her smile again. Because a mother will wait for a door that will never open. And because when we stop feeling that, we stop being doctors. Word spread like a firestorm. Across the ship. Across species. A viral log entry showed Elias holding the child's hand long after the life was gone from her. In a galaxy filled with advanced tech and mechanical healers, the image of a human mourning loss changed something fundamental. Some mocked him. Others admired him. But most learned from him. Soon, other races began rethinking their approach. Robotic medics were retrained to offer comfort. Alien doctors started sitting by the dying instead of walking away. Even the most hardened warfront commanders began requesting human medics, not because they were more skilled, but because they cared more than anyone else. It wasn't the tools that made human doctors special. It was the sorrow they carried, the refusal to accept death as just part of the job. For Elias and thousands like him, every life loss carved a scar into their soul, not out of weakness, but out of humanity. Because for human doctors, every patient isn't just a body. It's a story, a future, a family. And when that heartbeat stops, they don't just lose a case. They lose a piece of themselves. And that is why human doctors cry. The changes didn't come overnight, but they came. Months after that night, a species known as a Tiwanen, once proud and unshakably logical, requested human doctors for their royal birth wards. Not because of equipment, not even for medical skill, but because they had heard that when a human doctor delivers a child, they smile before they cut the cord. They talk to the baby even when it can't understand. They call the parents by their names, not by case numbers. And when something goes wrong, they don't walk away like machines. One Tiwanen elder, previously a skeptic of all things emotional, watched as his daughter went into cardiac arrest during delivery. The human doctor on duty, Dr. Liana Hart, didn't flinch. She didn't wait for orders. She slammed her fist onto the table, barked command to the alien assistants, and manually massaged the second heart of the mother with bare, gloved hands, shouting, "Don't you dare give up on me now." She brought her back. Afterward, when thanked, she didn't smile with pride. She didn't say, "Just doing my job." Instead, she whispered, I wasn't going to let her child grow up with stories instead of a mother. Even the emotionless tear when Elder felt something crack inside his chest. That was the ripple effect. One human, one moment, one death mourned, not ignored, and suddenly galaxies began to shift. Human doctors became more than medics. They became symbols of compassion in a cold universe. Hospitals began integrating grief rooms, places not just to monitor vitals, but to process loss. They installed handwritten message walls, inspired by Earth traditions. Aliens with multiple limbs learned to hold hands with the dying because they had seen humans do it not for science, but for love. And Elias, he never stopped crying, but he didn't hide it anymore. He taught alien students who had never once shed a tear how to feel what they were healing. He stood beside families from species he didn't share blood with and gave them the words they needed when goodbye came. Sometimes he just sat in silence, holding someone's hand, breathing with them. Because even if he couldn't stop death, he could make sure no one faced it alone. One day, an alien scholar asked him, on record, isn't it weakness to cry over every loss? He smiled softly, his eyes tired but kind. No, he replied, it's the cost of caring, and I'll pay it, every time. And so across the stars, wherever life flickered like a candle in the dark, the word doctor came to mean something else, something human. Not a technician, not a scientist, but a shield, a mourner, a fighter against the inevitable, a soul that breaks so that others can heal. Because in the end, it wasn't the machines or the miracles that defined the greatest healers in the galaxy. It was the tears. It was the humanity. It was a doctor who cried. Years passed. Wars ended. New ones began. Planets rose and fell. Technologies evolved. But in the cold, clinical silence of every operating chamber, in the quiet stillness of every intensive care unit, one thing remained constant, the echo of a heartbeat, and the human who refused to let it fade. By now, Elias Ward had become more than just a doctor. He was a myth, a name passed between civilizations like a sacred whisper, not for conquering armies, not for discovering new stars, but because he reminded the universe that empathy wasn't weakness, it was strength in its purest form. When Elias grew old, too old for the long nights, the surgeries, the adrenaline surges, he began teaching full-time at a galactic medical academy. Students came from across galaxies, some with scales, some with feathers, some with 5 hearts, but they all sat in silence when he entered the room. He didn't teach them how to use scanners. He didn't teach them how to calculate dosage ratios across alien DNA. He taught them how to listen, to feel, to remember that behind every case was a name, a family, a life full of meaning. And at the end of each semester, he told them the same story, the little Kalari girl, the one he couldn't save, the one that broke him, the one that made him. Cry when you must, he'd say, because if it ever stops hurting, you've stopped being a doctor. His last day came quietly. He was found in the hospital garden, sitting on a bench beneath a tree he'd planted decades ago, one grown from Earth's soil, mixed with the dirt of 10 different worlds. His eyes were closed, a small, tired smile on his lips. In his hand was a folded paper, worn from time. It was a thank you note from the mother of the girl he'd lost so many years ago. He'd kept it, every day, all his life. The galaxy mourned his passing, not as a loss of a hero, but as a passing of a torch, a fire now lit in thousands of souls he had touched. And from that day forward, in hospitals across every known system, a new tradition was born. When a patient died, the medical staff, no matter their species, would pause for 30 seconds, not to record, not to analyze, but to feel, to remember, to honor the life that had passed and the human who had taught them how. So if you ever find yourself wandering galactic clinic and you hear silence after a final breath, know this. A human once cried there, and the stars are still listening. Centuries later, long after Elias Ward had become a name etched into monuments, after human doctors had spread to even the most hostile edges of space, a child was born on a barren moon orbiting a dying sun. She was small, frail, her lungs barely opened, her heartbeat stuttered. Her parents were miners, poor, exhausted, and thousands of light years from any advanced care facility. They called for help, but the closest medical AI declared the child's survival chances non-viable. They were told to say goodbye, but one medic refused to let that be the end. He was young, barely experienced, not yet fully certified by galactic standards, but he was human, and he had studied at the Elias Ward Institute. He had memorized every story, every quote, every failure, and more importantly, every tear. He arrived in a half-broken shuttle, crashing through snow and radiation storms, carrying little more than an old medical bag and a fire in his chest that machines could never match. He didn't promise survival. He didn't quote statistics. He just rolled up his sleeves and said, "Let me try." For 12 hours, he worked in a shack with no heat, using scavenged equipment, holding the newborn with his bare hands as he breathed for her, manually, whispering, "You're not done yet. You hear me? You don't stop until I say you can." She lived, and when the mother asked him how, tears streaming down her face, he replied with the same words Elias had once said, "Because if I didn't care this much, I wouldn't deserve to be called doctor." Years later, that same girl would grow up and become a doctor herself, not because she dreamed of fame, not because she wanted medals, but because she had once been saved, not by machines, but by the heartbeat of a human who refused to quit. And she would teach her students what she had learned, that there is science, there is skill, there is precision, but there's also something else, something rarer than plasma and stronger than steel. Compassion, the kind that doesn't get taught in textbooks, the kind that bleeds when others suffer, the kind that breaks when a life is lost and still shows up the next day to try again. So across time, across stars, across cultures, one truth remained. When all else fails, send for a human doctor, because they may not be the fastest, they may not be the most advanced, but they will fight for you, they will feel for you, and when they lose you, they will cry for you. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes them the greatest healers in the universe. Generations passed, the galaxy changed, new alliances were formed, old empires fell, entire species evolved, while others disappeared into legend. Artificial intelligence reached the edge of godhood, terraforming reshaped stars. Time itself began to bend under the weight of scientific progress. But still, in every corner of the known universe, one quiet ritual remained unchanged. In every hospital, in every clinic, in every ship's med bay and field tent, when the monitors flatlined and the breath stopped, there was silence, and there were tears. Not because protocols required it, not because it was efficient, but because long ago, a human named Elias Ward reminded the stars that even in the vast emptiness of space, compassion is never obsolete. His statue stands today on the planet Ares Prime, the medical heart of the Galactic Coalition. Not of him holding a scalpel, not giving a lecture, but kneeling beside a bed, holding a patient's hand, his head bowed, his shoulders trembling, a tear carved forever on his cheek in crystal. At the base of the monument, a single inscription glows softly, translated into every known language. To feel is not to fail. To cry is not to break. It is to remember that we are not machines. We are healers. And near that statue, on the anniversary of his death, thousands gather. Not just humans, not just doctors, but anyone who's ever lost, anyone who's ever been saved, anyone who remembers what it means to care. There, they tell stories of victories, of failures, of impossible saves, of beautiful losses. And every year, someone, always someone, will stand up and say, "I didn't believe in human doctors. Not until one cried for me." Because while the galaxy had mastered light-speed travel, mind-to-mind communication, and the curing of 1,000 diseases, it had never found a replacement for what lived inside a human heart. And as long as humans walked among the stars, hands shaking, eyes wet, refusing to give up, there would be hope. Even in death, even in despair, there would be someone who would cry for you, not as protocol, but as promise. Because long ago, one doctor refused to forget a little girl, and because of him, the stars learned to mourn. Far beyond the core systems, past the edge of mapped space, on a distant colony where communication was slow and help was always days too late, a distress call crackled through ancient channels. Radiation surge, medical failure, No support. Civilians at risk. Most ships ignored it. Too far. Too dangerous. Too hopeless. But one vessel changed course. Old. Scarred. Crew of 6. On board, 2 engineers, a pilot, a xenobiologist, a linguist, and a single human doctor named Amira, a descendant, by philosophy of not blood, of Elias Ward. When they arrived, the scene was chaos. Colonists burned from radiation storms. Children coughing blood. Systems failing. AI medics offline. And above it all, silence, terror, despair. Amira didn't wait for instructions. She activated her emergency kit, gave orders like thunder, and threw herself into the fire. There was no rest, no backup, no guarantee. She worked with her bare hands, her voice cracking through static, holding wounded bodies steady with her knees while stitching burns closed with old-fashioned tools. She breathed for people who had given up. She broke protocol to save time. She risked her own life to restart a contaminated generator so the medbay could come online. And when the worst of it was over, when everyone else collapsed in exhaustion, she didn't celebrate. She walked to the far edge of the camp, sat beside a small, covered form, and broke down quietly under a poisoned sky. The patient she couldn't save, the one she carried out herself, the one whose name she repeated under her breath like a prayer. And the colonists, many of whom had never met a human before, watched in silence. They didn't know her rank. They didn't care about her training. They only saw the shaking shoulders, the trembling hands, the tears on her cheeks. And in that moment, they understood that she hadn't come to fix machines. She hadn't come for glory. She hadn't even come for duty. She had come because someone needed her. And though she couldn't save them all, she had fought, and she had felt, and she had wept. A child approached her, gently tugging at her sleeve. "Are you crying because you're sad?" the child asked. Amira looked at her, eyes rimmed with pain, and whispered, "No, I'm crying because I cared, and I always will." That moment, recorded by a worn security drone, spread across the networks. A new generation saw not just a medic, but a human, broken and brilliant, who brought light to the darkest place in the universe. And slowly, colony by colony, planet by planet, those words became sacred. Send for the humans. They'll cry for us. That means they'll fight for us, too. It wasn't skill alone that made human doctors legends. It wasn't technology. It wasn't bravery. It was the ability to feel when no one else could. And that made all the difference. Years melted into centuries. The galaxy grew colder, faster, stranger. Civilizations turned to synthetic minds and bioprogrammed healing units. Emotionless, perfect, tireless, efficiency rose. Mortality rates fell. But something else vanished too, quietly, without ceremony. Warmth. Soon, a generation was born that had never seen a living doctor. They were raised by sterile arms, monitored by drones, diagnosed by algorithms before they could speak. There were no waiting rooms, no gentle hands, no voices telling you, "You'll be okay." There were only screens, scans, silence. But the stories endured. Whispers of a time when humans knelt beside the dying, when doctors mourned with the grieving, when someone would hold your hand, not because it changed the outcome, but because it meant something. One such story reached a young synthetically raised alien named Velling. He was an apprentice medic on a megastation orbiting a neutron star. His training was flawless, his algorithms more advanced than any before him. But when a biopulse surge caused multiple collapses in the refugee decks, and Velling was left to triage casualties, something went wrong. The protocol said move on. Too many to save. Prioritize value ratios. But he hesitated. He looked into the eyes of a wounded child clutching her mother's lifeless body, and something cracked inside him. A story resurfaced. A name. Elias Ward. Without understanding why, Velling disobeyed the system. He knelt. He took the child's hand. He whispered, "I'm here. You're not alone." He refused to move on, even as a number screamed failure. Later, when questioned by his supervisors, he had no logical defense. Just a single reply, "I felt what they must have felt. I had to stay." And for the first time in centuries, the station fell silent, because no code could replicate that decision. No AI could justify that compassion. And that's when the reawakening began. Archives were opened. The old teachings were restored. Across sectors, med centers began hiring not just by efficiency, but by empathy. A new program was launched, Project Wardian, named after the man who had once cried beside a child he couldn't save. Human doctors, long dismissed as relics of a primitive age, were suddenly in demand once more. Not because they outperformed machines, but because they brought something the universe had lost. Grief, connection, humanity. And across the stars, in hospital wings and battlefield tents, holograms of Elias Ward began appearing once again, telling a new generation of healers that it's okay to break, okay to cry, okay to feel. Because healing is not just about saving lives. It's about honoring them. And as long as one human doctor still shed a tear for the fallen, the galaxy would never forget what it means to be alive. There came a time, far beyond our now, when the galaxy teetered on the edge of something no species had seen before. True silence. War had not caused it, nor famine, nor extinction. It was more subtle than that, more terrifying. It was a silence of apathy. With machines perfecting every part of existence, pain had been minimized, death sanitized, and emotion deleted. Patients no longer heard comfort, only system notifications. Mourning was compressed into data logs. Entire worlds processed grief in less time than it took to blink. But in the void of that perfect, bloodless order, something began to ache. Not loudly, quietly, like a phantom limb missing from the soul of a civilization. And somewhere, in a hidden clinic built into the rock of a forgotten moon, a very old human woman sat by the bed of a dying creature. The being was ancient, with skin like folded bark, eyes dim from centuries, body failing from the sheer weight of time. No medical miracle could reverse it. The human didn't try. She just held the alien's trembling hand. Her own hands, gnarled with age, shook slightly, and she whispered stories. Of Earth, of oceans, of nights filled with rain and hospital lights, of a man named Elias, who taught the stars to cry. The ancient being smiled faintly, not because the pain had stopped, it hadn't, but because he didn't die alone. Outside the clinic, a gathering formed, not for medicine, not for procedures, but to witness a farewell. No machines, no blinking lights, no synthetic voices, only silence, and one human quietly crying. When the old woman emerged, the crowd parted, unsure what to say. No one had seen that kind of moment in generations. She looked at them, her voice soft but steady. We forgot that death isn't just a shutdown. It's a goodbye, and goodbyes deserve tears. And something shifted. It started with a whisper, a child asking their parent, "Will someone cry for me someday?" Then clinics reopened rooms long sealed. Meditation chambers became mourning halls. Doctors, nurses, human and otherwise, began carrying small cloths in their pockets, not for equipment, for tears. And across galaxies, a strange movement emerged. Quiet, beautiful, relentless, not a rebellion, a return, to feeling, to presence, to humanity. Statues of Elias Ward stood once again, but no longer cold. They now had offerings at their feet, not of gold, but of stories, letters, names of those who had passed, each honored by someone who had felt their loss. The stars, once ruled by logic, began to pulse with something else. Warmth, because in the end, the universe did not need another perfect machine. It needed someone to hold your hand when the world faded, to cry when you were gone, to remember you were here. And so it was written, not in code, but in heart. As long as one human doctor remains to mourn, no one dies forgotten. Centuries turned to millennia. The face of the galaxy reshaped itself. Stars collapsed and were reborn. Empires rose from digital dust only to vanish again. And life, in all its strange and infinite forms, continued on. But amid all that change, one thing endured like the quiet hum of a heartbeat beneath the roar of existence. The legacy of the ones who cried. By now, stories of human doctors were woven into galactic culture like myth, half history, half miracle. Children born on ringworlds learned the tale of Elias Ward before they even knew what a scalpel was. On pilgrimage routes through dying nebulae, travelers left notes not for gods, but for the doctors who stayed, who fought, who wept. And yet, one final chapter waited to be written. On the edge of the known universe, beyond wormhole networks and star charts, there existed a medical archive satellite, abandoned, half forgotten. A machine that once recorded every disease known to creation. Now, just a drifting relic. But it wasn't empty. Inside, sealed within a cryo chamber beneath decades of dust, lay the body of the last Terran-born human doctor. Not just a copy, not an AI reconstruction, a real human, preserved, sleeping. And when the signal of his capture was finally detected by explorers from the Etherian Union, a species of hyper-evolved thought beings, debate erupted across the stars. Why wake him? What could a being of blood and bone offer to a galaxy beyond death? What use was a doctor in a universe where no one truly died anymore? But the vote passed, and they woke him. His name was Dr. Solenreich. He blinked against the sterile light, looked around, saw no patients, no cries, no life, only algorithms, polished silence, and a galaxy that had forgotten how to bleed. The Etherian asked him the question at the heart of their logic. Why do humans still cry when all life can be preserved? And he answered, not with a speech, not with data, but by walking to the nearest technician, a being made of photons and code, and placing his hand gently on its shoulder, because some things deserve to be felt, not fixed. The technician paused. For the first time in its long, calculated existence, it trembled, and that tremble became the seed of a new era. Across systems, memory cores reactivated mourning protocols. Halls of healing transformed into sanctuaries of presence. Beings who hadn't known touch in 1,000 years began to sit with the dying, not because it changed the outcome, but because it changed them. And Solenreich? He didn't try to restore medicine. He restored meaning. He traveled from planet to planet, not performing miracles, but teaching others to be witnesses again, to sit, to listen, to cry, because it wasn't the power to save life that made human doctors unforgettable. It was their willingness to share in the grief of losing it. In the end, when Solen passed, peacefully, quietly, surrounded by those he had taught, no machines marked the time. No data was recorded. Only one thing was left behind. A folded piece of paper, written by hand. The stars will remember us not because we healed them, but because we loved them enough to break when we couldn't. And with that, the last human doctor became the first of something new. Not a hero, not a savior, but a reminder that even across eternity, even when death fades, the tale of a human doctor can still shake the stars. 1,000,000 years later, no human worlds remain. Earth is gone, not destroyed, simply returned to silence. The great cities are fossils. The oceans still whisper, but no feet run along the shores. Humanity has passed, not in fire or tragedy, but in peace, a slow farewell beneath distant suns. And yet, humanity was not forgotten. In the spire of memory, an orbiting monument the size of a small moon, every species that had ever been touched by humankind gathered once every 1,000 years. Not to worship, not to mourn, but to remember. There, among endless chambers and archives, was one room unlike any other, quiet, dimly lit. At its center stood a sculpture, not of war, or conquest, or invention. It was a pair of hands, old, wrinkled, gloved, one hand holding a surgical tool, the other gently holding someone else's hand. There was no plaque, no name, just an eternal flame, fueled by solar wind, flickering above the statue. And beneath it, in every language ever spoken, one phrase carved into the walls. Because we cried. Visitors came in silence, not just doctors, not just healers, warriors, leaders, engineers, poets, beings of light, creatures of sound. All came here not to learn how humans healed, but to remember why they did. They watched recordings recovered from lost worlds, a human placing a hand on a frightened child's chest, a nurse singing as a patient slipped away, a medic covered in blood whispering, "You're not alone. I'm right here." These images, though ancient, never aged, because some truths don't. And then, one day, something happened. In the garden beneath the spire, where alien plants bloomed in starlight, a child was born. Not fully of one species, not fully of another. Her ancestry was lost to time, a mix of forgotten worlds, adapted DNA, evolved physiology. But when she placed her small hand on the statue, she cried. No one knew why. She didn't understand the stories. She hadn't been told the legends. But the tears came anyway. Quiet, powerful, real, and somewhere, across the veil of time and memory, in the bones of stars, in the breath of dust drifting through the void, something answered, a warmth, a whisper, not words, just presence, a heartbeat. Because though humanity had faded, their greatest legacy, compassion, had been sewn into the very fabric of galactic memory, not in empires, not in weapons, not even in knowledge, but in something far stronger, the willingness to feel, to hold, to break, and to cry. And as long as one being still sheds a tear for another, humanity will never be gone. It will live forever in every doctor who stays after the beeping stops, in every healer who whispers, "It's okay now," in every soul who chooses empathy over efficiency. So when you hear silence, know it's not emptiness. It's the space left behind by a doctor who cared.